Okay, super. First of all, I have to say that yesterday was actually my last day at Westminster, so I've left there, and I now have a new organization called Council on Global Security, so where I'll be continuing to work on the same things. So I just wanted to say that. I want to touch on three subjects, three countries: Nigeria, Egypt, and Syria. What I want to say first about Nigeria is it's actually, in a way, it's been very good for our cause because it really has focused the world's attention on what's going on there and the nature of Boko Haram and actually the nature of the Islamists. So I've been really impressed by the coverage of it. I was at an event yesterday at the Hudson Institute where they had a victim of Boko Haram speaking. This is a really lovely teenager who was brought to this country by the 9/11 Foundation back in the summer. They bring victims of terrorism to the United States for a kind of healing camp workshop thing. And I won't go into the details, but look up her story. Debbie had a really harrowing experience, and I've been watching Hudson and Emmanuel Ogebe and Nina Shea speak about these issues for years, and it's always like a handful of people who show up. And yesterday they had a full battery of television cameras. So it's really getting a lot of coverage, and I think that's great. And I also add that there are some interesting lessons for all of us, who are activists, to learn from the Nigeria lesson, because it was below the radar screen for many years. But I think that the work that we all did, prior to this moment was incredibly important. And I can say for myself, as an activist, as an analyst, as a think tank type, I really learned a lot from being we formed something called the Working Group on Nigeria. And we were just, a small group, like we all are, we're all sort of fighting the battle from our desks and often feeling quite isolated, and also I think often feeling like our work is getting nowhere. But it was really interesting to see, and I can see now how once there is that breakout story, that preliminary work was incredibly important. And I'd like to stress the importance of that. So, for example, in a couple of concrete areas, one of the things that we did was we paid very close attention to what the State Department was saying about Nigeria. And we called them on it. Every time they came out with a report, we would analyze it and challenge them on their facts. And, I remember the first time we went in and did this, and we were kind of angry and hostile, and I think we really got nowhere. The next year we were smarter about it, came back with a very detailed list of the inaccuracies, and it really had an impact. And I think that type of activity is really important. And on that note, I will say one thing to look out for is the State Department apparently is about to announce a new ambassador at large for international religious freedom. So as you all know, Suzanne Johnson Cook was in the position for, I think it was just maybe a couple of years. She was widely felt to be, kind of a failure in that position. She didn't do a whole lot. I thought it was very interesting. I was speaking with somebody at the State Department the other day who acknowledged even internally she was not considered successful, and he was saying that may be part of the reason why it's been slow to appoint a new one, because they don't want to make the same mistake twice. But I think all of us who care about how religious minorities are treated in the Middle East, it's very important to pay attention to who this next ambassador is, and actually to make contact with them. It's always good, especially I think early on when they're first appointed, they tend to be more open to meeting with people. Their schedules aren't as busy. Get in there, talk to them, establish a relationship, and get a feeling for them. So I think that's important. I think it's also important that we all pay attention to the State Department's report on international religious freedom when it comes out, because it tends to be very skewed politically and ideologically. And as Sarah was saying, the State Department has just consistently downplayed the issue of Islam, that, they've consistently downplayed the nature of this conflict. And I think it's important that we all challenge that we do it publicly, we do it in articles, that we do it directly with them, and that we do as much as we can to provide a counter argument, and to the extent that it's possible, to provide sort of a factual challenge to their arguments as well. So I won't say more about that, but that's Nigeria. The two I really want to focus on are Egypt and Syria. These are both at a really pivotal moment right now, and for looking at this through the lens of the concern about Islamists and the concern about how minorities are treated in the Middle East, I think these are the two of the key countries right now. So Egypt, as you all know, is about to have elections. Sisi is going to win it hands down, and there's a lot of criticism. The Muslim Brotherhood lobby here is so strong. Their PR is so good. I was at an event the other day. I don't know if anybody else was there, but they had the head of the Constitutional Committee was here last week and was supposed to give a talk at the Four Seasons Hotel in Georgetown. And he didn't come down into the room. Apparently he was upstairs in the restaurant. He didn't even want to come in because the Muslim Brotherhood was there in such force, and they were so aggressive in their outbursts and their questions to the speakers that he simply never came down. I think there was a fear of, they were going to throw a shoe or they were going to really disrupt the meeting. So, I think that's real testimony to how powerful the Muslim Brotherhood is in this country, and we need to be aware of that. And they're certainly active on the issue of this election that's coming up. But I think, there are definitely valid concerns about Sisi. If you remember, there were a number of NGO people arrested under Morsi. They have not been pardoned, and apparently that's a big issue. And somebody even suggested that this is the reason Leahy is holding up the military aid to Egypt. As you know, Obama released it, and then Leahy blocked it. So that may be one of the reasons why. And obviously, these multiple death sentences that you've probably all heard about, I think it was over 1,000 death sentences that the courts handed down, probably not a good sign, But in spite of these things, I think Sisi has the potential to really be interested in democracy, in something more democratic, certainly, than we saw under Mubarak and under Morsi. And maybe even most important, he is really fighting the Islamists and doing quite a good job of it. I think there's been very good cooperation with the Israelis in fighting the terrorists in the Sinai. This is incredibly important. It's important for us. So I think for now, we should, be open-minded, I think, toward his potential presidency and toward what's happening in Egypt. And I think to the extent that we can encourage our members in Congress to get this aid approved, it's probably going to be in all of our interests. Speaking specifically about the issue of minorities, the new Constitution is definitely better. Obviously, a Constitution based on Sharia is always a little bit alarming, but I think that there are clear statements to protect minorities. The Army is currently involved in rebuilding churches, which is a huge step. So again, I think they're very conscious. I think Sisi has the full support of the Pope, of Pope Tewodros, the head of the Coptic Church, and also of the evangelical pastors. And I think he's very conscious of the fact that Egypt in the 21st century has to find a way to live with its Christians and to live with minorities, religious, ethnic minorities within its midst. And I think they're going to make a really conscious effort to do a better job. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes forward. Lastly, I just want to mention Syria. I think Syria is the most, obviously the biggest concern because they are in the midst of an outright civil war. And actually what I should also throw out here, the common theme in all these countries is that I feel like the United States is consistently on the wrong side of the argument. So, obviously Nigeria, we said for years, our State Department was just insistent that this was not religious in nature. And not only that, but if you look closely at the language they use, they repeatedly said that Boko Haram kills Muslims, and then they would say Christians. Like it was always as if Boko Haram was killing more Muslims than Christians. Egypt, again, I mean, we've gone sort of back and forth, but obviously we were very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood for a long time. I think now we're kind of waffling on that issue, but still withholding full support from Sisi. Syria, I think what we're doing is really dangerous. Nobody likes Assad, but I think a lot of people understand now that if Assad goes down right now, not in a slow, not in a gradual transition, but if he's brought down rapidly, it will be utter chaos, and it will spill over far beyond Syria. So why the United States is so insistent on bringing down Assad is beyond me, and I think it's completely unrealistic to think that this current opposition is going to be able to provide a viable leadership. So as you all may have seen, the Syrian opposition was actually here in D.C. this week. They met with Kerry, I think, on Monday, and then yesterday they met with Obama and Rice. Now, there was a lot of talk for a while of U.S. providing anti-aircraft missiles, but I think now it looks like what the opposition is asking for is that the U.S. implement a no-fly zone over Syria in order to neutralize the regime's air force. Nothing's been said about whether that has been approved or not, but that's maybe something to look for. The problem with the current opposition is that they do not have a lot of support inside Syria. And again, I think virtually everybody in Syria wants to see change. I don't think anybody loves Assad. But again, I think they're so much more afraid of what's going to follow that even people who were in strong opposition to him would rather see a gradual transition than to see him pulled down. Now, obviously, the Christians are in sort of unique and kind of uniquely difficult position in Syria. Everybody right now is suffering in Syria, but the Christians are in a particularly difficult position in part because they're seen to be supporters of Assad. And I've heard the accusation that the United States is sending a lot of humanitarian assistance to Syria. We're sending $1.7 billion in humanitarian aid. But I've heard the accusation that this aid is not reaching the Christian areas. For example, there's an area called the Valley of the Christians, and that aid is not going to them because they are seen as pro-regime. And so that therefore aid is being used in a kind of political way. We have not had time to research that accusation, but I think if that's true, it would be really, really horrendous. Now, there's something going on in Syria that I think is interesting for the whole region, and it hasn't gotten any news, but it's an interesting development, and that is that up in the northeast, which is like you have Kurds, you have Syriacs, you have Christians, and you have Arabs. And they've formed a kind of self-administrative government. It's an experiment, but at the moment it seems to be working. So what they've done is, what happened is that the regime basically had to pull its forces out of the area because it had to fight bigger battles over on the west. And So what people did was they came together, the different communities, the Arabs, the Christians, the Kurds, they came together. They said, let's find a way to sort of put aside our differences and just protect ourselves and keep our society functioning. And at the moment, it's working. And I think that's an interesting model to contrast with this U.S. support for an opposition that does not have domestic support. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. So, I mean, I would say this is a very quick overview of the three, what I consider to be right now, three critical countries. Again, I would just say that Nigeria, in a way, was really encouraging to see that, you know, you can operate in obscurity for years, but the work really does have an impact after a while. And so I think it's important that we all keep doing what we're doing. So I'll take questions if anybody has any questions.
Okay, this is Sarah. As the moderator, I'll take the liberty to ask the first question. I think that the issue of Syria is extraordinarily complicated, and while we know that religious minorities throughout have not been treated at all well by Assad, one of the things that we're most afraid of right now is a nexus between Iran and Hezbollah. And I think we might have a different interpretation of what's going on right now. And we see that the rebels are linked with al-Qaeda, and they're certainly not advocates of constitutional religious freedoms, but neither is Iran. And as we know, in Iran, Christians are massacred. There's a horrible death rate. That last year there were 600 hangings of religious minorities and gay homosexuals in Iran, and apparently under Hassan Rouhani this year it's going to be actually more at the current rate. So I'm wondering, you know, this is probably, I'm sorry, this is probably more of a comment than a question. We're not really in favor of either position at this point, and I don't want it to seem like we're advocating for the Assad regime.
No, I think you're making very good points. But I also think that I'm not advocating for one or the other either. Mm-hmm. But I think, first of all, I don't know to what extent we can equate Assad with Iran. I mean, obviously they're allied. Iran is sending him support. But, for example, what I've heard is that even the Israelis at this point would rather see Assad stay in place than to have him overthrown and have the Islamists take over. So I'm not. I'm just saying it's like we have right. You know, it's like we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. Right. It's almost like there's no good solution.
There's no good solution. I think we could agree on that. Some more questions?
I don't know if it was next up or not. This is Amanda from Congresswoman Bachman's office. I guess the only other question I had was if there was like immediate things that you're asking members of Congress to do. What would messaging or legislation? Just maybe, I know it's a broader question, but if there's like a few points that you want to hit on as far as I guess more so messaging in a sense, especially with regards to Syria.
Well, I think making sure that the humanitarian support is reaching everybody. I definitely think that's a big concern. And Syria is tough. I mean, Syria reminds me of like Albania when the Berlin Wall first came down. It's that so few people had spent time there and really knew about it and understood it that people hardly talked about it. And I feel like that's kind of the same with Syria. And plus, it is a deeply complex situation. But I'm also I feel like the United States, we've come in and we've decided who the opposition is going to be, who we're going to support. And I'm just really nervous that we're setting ourselves up for failure. So I don't know, beyond making sure that the humanitarian support is being evenly and fairly distributed. Unfortunately, right now I don't have I don't think there is a clear message. I just hope people will continue to pay attention to what happens there, because if Syria devolves into chaos, I think it's going to just have such a profound impact for the whole region.
I have to, at this point, put a plug in for what the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are doing up on the Golan Heights. Throughout the 3-year civil war in Syria, there have been, as you know, 150,000 casualties. And the IDF has set up field hospitals, and they have been treating the wounded. And they have actually been confounding people who have been raised on such anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli hatred about who the Israeli and the Jews are. And this is just another quiet way that Israel is trying to provide humanitarian aid to the thousands and thousands of wounded around the globe, in this case Syrian. And I know that they have sent people to Nigeria to try to find over 200 young kidnapped girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram.
That's interesting, because I had heard that the Israelis had offered. So do you think the Nigerians accepted the offer?
Well, I know that they've sent people over there. I don't know.
Oh.
I would imagine that the Nigerians accepted it if they went.
Well, yes, if they've actually sent people, the offer would have been accepted. So that's great.
Right.
Yeah, that's very good.
Hey, hello. This is Gary Miller. I'm from Philadelphia area. I have actually several things that I would like for you to address, beginning with the fact that there's going to be a new ambassador appointed for international relations for international religious freedom. What is the attitude, though, of the State Department to the next person that's going to be in this position? Will they actually support them, or will they really just hide the facts and try to politicize what's going on? And then the other thing I wanted to ask is the reception in Egypt, Syria, Nigeria overall towards, is anything changing in terms of being more concerned about the religious freedom of the minorities? And then how is Congress reacting to any of this information? And is there information that should be directed to any particular committees?
Well, I think regarding the ambassador, I don't think there's going to be any significant change in the low priority that religious freedom gets with this administration. I think for that, we're going to have to wait for another administration. But at the same time, I think what's happened with Boko Haram in Nigeria has really changed the game. They can't ignore it any longer, and I also think they've gotten such a hand slapping over the fact that they took so long to designate Boko Haram as a terrorist organization, and that they downplayed the religious dimension for so long, that I think they're going to have to be a lot more careful and a lot more on the ball. Many people have noted that the placement of the ambassador not being directly under the Secretary of State the way other ambassadors are is a problem. I don't think that's going to change. But beyond that, I think it's just going to come down to the personality of the person. I mean, I think they're going to probably continue to have a sort of progressive leftist orientation just because this administration is what it is. But they may still be able to be more effective. I think it all depends on who gets chosen. That's why it's important that we pay attention to who it is, comment on it, reflect on it, make contact with them, put pressure on them. So there's that possibility, I think, to have an impact on them. And the problem is they really aren't that concerned with religious freedom. But again, as you can see, like what's happening with Nigeria, they're getting on board because they can pitch it as women's freedom, or the war on women, and so then they do take it up more. But I just don't think it's going to significantly change. In Congress, I do think Congress is like slowly waking up a little bit more. There is a caucus on international religious freedom. I know that it has now a new co-chair, Mike McIntyre. I think the co-chairs are Trent Franks and on the Democratic side, Mike McIntyre. And then I've also heard there's another member named Sean Duffy who is involved. And if people want to get more involved in this issue, there is a very good roundtable there's a roundtable that takes place in Washington called the International Religious Freedom Roundtable. They meet, I think, about every couple of months. It's Congressman Frank's office sponsors it, and it's a good way to find out who's on top of the issue, who's concerned about the issue, and what are some of the different ways it's being pursued. And I think getting involved with that group can be an effective way to push this issue forward.
Hi. I was wondering, Katharine, if you could tell us, of the 9 million people that I've read so far that have left Syria, are most of them Christians? Where do they go, and who's taking care of them?
No, they're definitely not mostly Christians, because Christians are only a very small percentage of the overall population. So by far the majority are the Muslims, and the majority of the Muslims, well, the way it goes is the wealthiest ones get to the United States or to Western Europe. Then the next tier get out to surrounding countries like Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon. And then the poorest ones end up in refugee camps. And as you know, those numbers have been exploding. There is also a very large number of internally displaced people. The Christians, we've been told that the Christians are not actually ending up in the refugee camps because of the sectarian tensions. It's not felt that it's safe for them. So, for example, Turkey did build a refugee camp down near the Syrian border that was going to specifically be for Christians, and even that one, they didn't want to go to it. So what Christians are doing is they're tending to move around more internally, and they move in with other Christian families. So this has been a real strain. I know Lebanon in particular has taken a huge number of refugees, and people just move in with other families, which is, you can imagine it's really, really tough. So that's kind of where the situation is at right now.
Thank you.
I wanted to make a comment and ask a question. This is Ron Thompson. Your comments on northeast Syria sounded very encouraging, and I was wondering a little bit if that group that's forming might ally with the Kurds in northeast Iraq. That could be finally a state for the Kurds, which would certainly have every interest in allying with the United States. But my main question has to do, I'm still curious about this distinction between Islamists and Islam proper. It seems to me that the people in Boko Haram are very good Muslims, and the only difference between them and mainstream Muslims is they are acting on the beliefs in the Quran, whereas most Muslims, especially in the Middle East, feel this way, even if they wouldn't take these extreme actions. So is it proper to keep on calling them Islamists rather than good Muslims in action or something like that? Right.
Well, okay, to answer your first question, I know, I understand your concern about the Kurds in Iraq, but unfortunately it's not going to work because the Kurds in northeastern Syria are from a different tribe than the Kurds in northern Iraq, and they're sort of competing tribes. So I think that there will not be, this is not going to be a way for the Kurds of Iraq to whatever, they're not going to get involved with this. And honestly, I think if they did get involved with this, it would make it not work, because then there would be fears that this northeast corner of Syria would be annexed into like a greater Kurdistan. So that's the situation there. I hear what you're saying, and it's on the question of moderate Islam versus Islamists. I mean, this is a very complex question, and I take the position that the Islamists, the radicals, the terrorists, I do not say that they are un-Islamic, because there absolutely is religious justification for what they do. We all know what it is. I mean, it's in the Quran, it's in the fatwas. So to call them un-Islamic, I think, is inaccurate. But I also think I see the possibility that there are other Muslims that are not going to live this way. I've really seen Muslims in the Middle East who want to find a way to live with their minorities, to live with Christians, to live with Jews. Now, even if there's still a bias inside or a prejudice, which I do absolutely think is there, I still think that they want to try to find a way to live side by side. And you're even hearing comments from Muslims saying things like, I've heard Muslim leaders say that they are proud that Christianity was born in their country, or that, it has ancient roots in their country. I've heard Egyptian Muslims say that Christianity has always been an ancient part of Egypt. So personally, I'm more hopeful for, the possibility that ultimately we are going to find a way for Muslims and Christians to live together. We're just not quite there yet. And honestly, to be fair as well, I think it's a battle and it's a question going on within the world of Islam itself. They are fighting this out, So it has yet to be resolved, but I'm not completely despairing about it.
Could I add a comment?
Fine by me.
Okay. Within the last half hour, I watched a tape by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and she said two interesting things. On the one hand, she said, as you feel, I think there is a possibility for Islam to be reformed. And then a few minutes later, she said, if there is no recognition of the problem in the center of Islam, I'm paraphrasing, this is not an exact quote, as long as Muslims say that what goes on in Boko Haram and other places has nothing to do with Islam, there is no reform, which means that I think even allowing for the decent human impulses of the kind of Muslims you've mentioned, it's not our problem that they have an existential problem with the core teachings of their religion. And I don't think we do anybody a favor in the long run unless we look at that.
I agree. Yeah. Okay. No, I think 100%. And I think it's so disingenuous. Andrew Harrod, who some of you may know, wrote a great piece the other day when CARE did a press conference. CARE and some of the other Muslim groups here did a press conference about the Nigerian girls, and they completely whitewashed who Boko Haram is. And I agree with you. They're not doing anybody any favors with that. But then I think there are other people, like especially Egypt, for example, right now, where there's really a fight between the kind of, let's call them mainstream Muslims and the Islamists. There's a real war going on within Egypt over what Islam will be in that country. And that I think is what gives me hope. And I know also that for all of us who've been concerned with this issue for a long time, many of us have said, if moderate Muslims are really so opposed to the violence, and if violent Islam is so un-Islamic, why aren't the moderates fighting it more? Why aren't they doing more to speak out about it? And I think finally they are, because I think it's starting to blow back on them. And it's starting to hurt them as well. So, having said that, I will say I do continue to be a little bit hopeful,
Thank you so much, Katharine. On that hopeful note, I think we're going to conclude this conversation. I do also want to say there are wonderful Muslims like Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who has tried to have a reformation within Islam, and many other religions have gone through more violent periods but have gone through an internal reformation, and I'm hoping that at least, in our children's or grandchildren's generation, that this bloodshed will stop. Thank you so much. We're going to, as you know, we've embarked on these conference calls for people that can't get away from their desks and can't come to Washington to meet with some of our esteemed experts, such as Katharine Gorka, and we will be continuing this next month. And just a commercial announcement, if anybody could possibly make it to Washington, we're going to be having a Rays of Light in the Darkness dinner on June 18th, and our honorees will include Dr. Charles Krauthammer, Governor Mike Huckabee, Congressman Pete Rostam, Congressman Dan Lipinski, and Dr. Ashraf Mala. So if you're interested in coming, please log on to www.emetonline.org. Thanks very much for your time.